To watch all of my exclusive content not featured here on my channel, log on to my website at imjustheretomake.com/films.
Now, when it comes to the life of Harriet Tubman, you might think all there is to know about her life has already been uncovered. Well, thanks to an archaeologist with the State Highway Administration, that statement couldn't be further from the truth. Today, we've learned they found the home of Harriet Tubman's father, Ben Ross. Ben Ross was enslaved on the Thompson plantation, less than a mile away from the Broadus plantation where Harriet was enslaved.
Well, we know that in 1836, Anthony Thompson's will, and he was the person who enslaved Ben Ross, he put in there that, and 5 years from his death, that Ben would be manumitted, freed, and be given 10 acres. Not only the will, but also some land deeds over time began to mention Old Ben's place. Not only the will, but also some land deeds over time began to mention Old Ben's place.
Not only the will, but also some land deeds over time began to mention Old Ben's place.
Alongside the road, in this location by the water. And putting those clues together, we had a search area.
Finding this land and the artifacts that came along with it gives insight into exactly how Ben Ross lived.
When she showed us the fragments of some of the plates, when she showed us the fragments of some of the plates, things like that, and I looked at them, I said, wow. I asked her, I said, this is, to me, it looks highly decorative. I didn't expect to see something like this used by enslaved people. To me, it looks highly decorative. I didn't expect to see something like this used by enslaved people, because for him to have been given 10 acres, you know, and freedom, but mostly that 10 acres, that's something that's not common. It also humanizes him. It makes a connection for us as a family.
So each artifact has a story, it has an object it's linked with, and the more we excavate, the more we find, the more we can really reconstruct how Ben Ross lived there in the marshlands.
So each artifact has a story, it has an object it's linked with, and the more we excavate, the more we find, the more we can really reconstruct how Ben Ross lived there in the marshlands.
The state park eventually plans to have the site open to the public after excavation is complete and a safe pathway has been created.
The Treasury Department is working to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. The Civil War-era abolitionist leader would replace President Andrew Jackson. It was confirmed by White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki on Monday.
The Trump administration, the Obama administration initially had wanted to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. The Trump administration dragged their feet on that. I wanted to see if the Biden administration has a sort of view of the timeline on whether or not she should be on the paper currency.
I was here when we announced that, and it was very exciting. It hasn't moved forward yet, which we would have been surprised to learn at the time. The Treasury Department is taking steps to resume efforts to put Harriet Tubman on the front of the new $20 notes. It's important that our notes, our money, if people don't know what a note is, reflect the history and diversity of our country, and Harriet Tubman's image gracing the new $20 note would certainly reflect that. So we're exploring ways to speed up that effort. But
the move was originally put on hold by the Trump administration after being introduced by President Obama. Officials say it could still take a few years to be implemented.
Welcome. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And today I'm excited to have with me Harriet Tubman. How are you, Harriet?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Mr. Depew, for having me today.
Well, you know, I just heard that recently Sarah Bradford, I believe a good Quaker lady, has had an opportunity to interview you, and she just published a book in 1869 about your life.
Yes, she did.
So I'm going to cover a lot of the same territory that she covered in that interview, but thrilled that you agreed to do this with us, and thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome, kind sir, and I have the book with me.
Oh, my.
This is it. It's a very nice book.
People have been told many different things concerning the Underground Railroad story, and somehow the story is being carried out as if it was just a myth. In some instances, some history tellers would say that the Underground Railroad had nothing to do with a railroad or even being underground. But just like numerous things that are considered to be American history today, this opinion that we were all told is false. People who were born between the 1950s and beyond were told that the Underground Railroads were safe houses for runaway slaves, while people who were born in the 1930s and earlier were told that the Underground Railroads were actual railroads that people utilized in order to vacate their jobs. The significant differences between both stories is quite obvious, but just in case you were wondering why, let's go over why the phrase runaway slave was used later on in history books and other correlating curriculums. You can recall how the story of slavery goes. A slave master is the owner of those he or she enslaved, and that a slave's daily duty was commonly rather known as a laborer for his or her owner or slave master. The truth is that a so-called slave master's position was literally the employer, no matter their hue of complexion, and the so-called slave's position was literally the employee. The majority of people today are at-will employees, and the contract that you sign in order to become employed by a company means that you can quit or be released from your job at will. But during so-called slavery times, these same contracts were binding for much longer periods of time. Once or if your contract expires, you were then released or freed from all duties. So, when you hear the story of a person escaping via the Underground Railroad, this was a person that was attempting to leave their job before the expiration of their binding contracts, if they had one. So, why was it an Underground Railroad? Because even the right of transit for a slave, or rather a fugitive, was denied if their contract was not completed. So, what is the Underground Railroad? Upon the arrival of foreigners, they discovered a transportation system that ran both above and underground. This transportation system was previously designed to run from coast to coast, aligning parallel with the canals and rivers throughout North America. The expansiveness of these ancient railway structures was so great in numbers that it was very difficult for any foreigner to even attempt to regulate them all during this time period and even the days of so-called slavery. Now, you can get an idea of what these underground railroads looked like if you were to visit, say, your local train stations, for example. Upon close examination, you will notice that there are usually 2 to 3 sets of tracks, in which one set typically includes a left side track and a right side track. In more common use areas, only 2 sets out of a possible 3 are being used today, leaving one to wonder why one set of tracks are currently not in use. According to the routes that are displayed on the maps of the Underground Railroads, they directly correlate with the same routes of service that are still being used today, and even with some of the much older railway destinations that has since been removed, and also with portions of the railway system that ran deep underground. Now, I know what you're thinking. Everything is not a conspiracy, but not everything happens out of pure coincidence neither. A great amount of these much older and more narrow-like tracks ran through hundreds of different mines that led directly into a variety of mounds and mountains throughout the lands. And only the people that were familiar with these routes could conduct a method of transportation for others who are seeking freedom, or rather seeking to quit their jobs. America's history's most famous trophy to use when it comes to campaigning the so-called slave story that was alleged to have occurred here in North America is none other than Harriet Tubman. In the year 1896, at a suffrage convention, or rather a voting convention for women's rights in New York, Harriet Tubman was allegedly quoted stating the following: "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." End quote. What's very interesting to note about this quote is that she indicated to the public what her job's description and position was for 8 years with the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman acknowledged that she was literally a train conductor, in which a train conductor is responsible for the overall operations of rail systems and safety measures for its oncoming passengers. So in this quote, which was said to have been stated by Harriet Tubman directly, she admits to performing her duties without error, while also indicating that she cannot say the same for other conductors of the Underground Railroad. So the question remains, how was Harriet Tubman cognizant of the routes ranging from southern to northern parts of these lands and all the way to Canada, with her being an alleged runaway slave? And how is it that Harriet Tubman hinted that it was more than one conductor of the Underground Railroad, but she was the only one chosen to be duly noted by American history? Who are the others? What is also very important to note here is that many of the locations that were originally known and listed as stations were later changed to be described as safe houses. For example, on October 10th, 1980, a House Resolution Act was passed by Congress that allowed for the establishment of the Boston African American National Historic Site, the African American Meeting House, and it also allowed for the creation and development of the free African American community within the Beacon Hill area in Boston, Massachusetts. This 1980 Act was signed into law to grant executive authorization, or rather, quote, cooperative agreements between the Secretary of the Interior of the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service Department to choose any, quote, sufficient properties within the boundary of the site and can determine that, quote, area as the Boston African American National Historic Site. The copper-colored residents of the Beacon Hill area were already suffering from an undergoing gentrification process by way of the government during this time period, and politicians with political power thought it would be a great opportunity to cover a lie with another lie and another lie and then another lie. And here's why. Particular properties of the Beacon Hill area, whether publicly or privately owned, were chosen by the Secretary to immediately become official historic locations, taught throughout American history and even African American history. And many of these chosen locations were in fact not the original location of the story it represents. In fact, the famously known Hayden House of Boston, Massachusetts was chosen by the Secretary of the Interior as a safe house of the Underground Railroad, in which he commissioned the National Center for the Study of Afro-American History and Culture that same year in order to create the story behind it, knowing that their story is absolutely not true. Now, in conclusion, people would say that history was written by the victors, and that's the reason why history is the way it is. But I will have to disagree with them, merely because only a loser will have the audacity to write a story to make it seem as if they won when they didn't. Which segues into the story of Harriet Tubman, which is one of the many objects that has been used in our history books as a slave ship in a sense for several years now, even though the origin of the story was truthfully meant to garner an influx of money and public attention from a certain group of people by being utilized as a symbol to make servants feel like leaders and to draw out human emotions that are attached to a said hero or heroine. That alone is just one of the many reasons why the story of Harriet Tubman has been recreated over and over again as a book and as a movie. But what if you never heard of this story in school before? How would you even know about slavery? Would you hear it from your parents or your grandparents? Can you even recall how many times they have mentioned Harriet Tubman to you? In the English language, the word Harriet is defined in 1828 as an estate ruler, and the word Tubman is defined as in the exchequer, a barrister so-called. An exchequer is a legal term that meant to institute a process against a person in a court of revenue, and a barrister is a counselor learned in the laws, qualified and admitted to plead at the bar relating to the entitlement of the crown. Then, the story of Harriet Tubman was created in 1869, according to an act of Congress in 1869 that was entered into the clerk's office of the District Court for the Northern District of New York by William G. Wise. The name of this story, written by Sarah H. Bradford, is Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, published by W.J. Moses Printer in 1869, and then once again in 1961. Now, in the introduction of this book, located in page 1, it states a lot of essential information. Listen closely. The following little story was written by Miss Sarah H. Bradford of Geneva, with the single object of furnishing some help to the subject of the memoir. Harriet Tubman's services and sufferings during the rebellion, which are acknowledged in the letters of General Saxton and others, it was thought by many would justify the bestowment of a pension by the government. But difficulties in the way of procuring such relief suggested other methods, and finally the present one. The narrative was prepared on the eve of the author's departure for Europe, where she still remains. It makes no claim whatever to literary merit. Her hope was merely that the considerably numerous public, already in part acquainted with Harriet's story, would furnish purchasers enough to secure a little fund for the relief of this remarkable woman. Outside that circle, she did not suppose the memoir was likely to meet with much of any sale. In furtherance of the same benevolent scheme, and in order to secure the whole avails of the work for Harriet's benefit, a subscription has been raised more than sufficient to defray the entire cost of publication. this has been effected by the generous exertions of William G. Wise, Esquire, of this city. The whole amount contributed by citizens of Auburn, with the exception of 2 liberal subscriptions by Jared Smith, Esquire, and Mr. Weldon Phillips. Mr. Wise has also consented, at Mrs. Bradford's request, to act as trustee for Harriet and will receive, invest, and apply for her benefit whatever may accrue from the sale of this book. End quote. So, a month after the act of June 27, 1890, which stated that pensions could be granted to widows and soldiers that have been incapacitated, Harriet Tubman allegedly filed for a pension for her deceased husband, Nelson Davis, who had died in October the year prior. And all of these affidavits were filed and signed under the moniker of Harriet Davis. Now, even though she was awarded an $8 pension per month on July 24, 1890, it was said that she later returned to file several more affidavits at different times, in 1892, 1894, and in 1895, all of which were allegedly signed by Harriet Tubman herself as Harriet Davis, or so one may assume. Keep in mind that the lawyer, Mr. Wise, was appointed as the trustee for Harriet Tubman at the request of the author of Harriet Tubman's story, Sarah Bradford. They were adamant about attempting to get her pension raised to $25 per month, but was denied by the Committee of Pensions. And then it was later ruled that Harriet would receive a pension of exactly $20 per month. Does this have something to do with wanting her face on a $20 bill? Harriet Tubman had to pay a lawyer fee of $10 for each affidavit filed, and each affidavit listed personal information that would allegedly corroborate the story of Harriet Tubman's existence, and also provide details to support all of the information that could only be found in Sarah Bradford's book for some strange reason. It stated details on how she met her second husband, Nelson Davis, and it also provided dates of particular events, like when Nelson enlisted as a soldier, the date of their marriage, and the date of his death. But then, oddly enough, unnecessary information about her past life was also included in these affidavits, like information about her first husband, John Tubman, mentioning that she was a scout in the Union Army, providing her location of birth being Dorchester, Maryland, along with her background story about how she was once a slave. It also included missing vital information, like it stating that she lived in Cayuga, New York, but no mention of her exact address, nor does it list anything about her date of birth or any information about her past and current jobs to be able to afford these lawyer fees, nor does it mention the name Araminta Ross, or when and why she changed her first name to Harriet. So, why would she go out of her way to share a book-like story about herself that was totally unnecessary in order to just simply verify that she is Nelson's widow, but not include vital information like, for example, her current address in order for the government to mail the pension to her in the first place? The story of Harriet Tubman has been contradictory each time it was recreated. She has been called an abolitionist, a political activist, then a spy for the Union, and a conductor of the Underground Railroad. Then she was said to have been a teacher and a nurse. But yet, some authors claim that she was illiterate and couldn't read or write. So what did she teach if she couldn't read? And how did she learn how to be a nurse for soldiers that were dying during the Civil War without being able to write. And what's way more important than that, all of these affidavits were said to have been filed and signed by Harriet Tubman herself, but they were actually written in full by other people on her behalf at her request, allegedly. And I say allegedly because the affidavit that was filed in order to give particular people permission to write and speak on Harriet's behalf was done so on the date of May 7th, 1895, which was well after the previous affidavits between the years of 1890 and 1894 were already on file. But this particular affidavit seemed as if Harriet Tubman wrote it herself, due to her stating, quote, "My affidavit of June 16th, 1894 and November 10th, 1894 were both written in my presence." But then the paragraph underneath it states, "The above testimony was all written in my presence," instead of saying, "My testimony was all written in my presence." What is very important to note here is that she only mentioned 3 affidavits being done in her presence, the 2 in 1894 and this one in 1895, with no mention of the previous affidavits. And here's the problem with that. The previous affidavits that were allegedly filed by Harriet Tubman herself has the exact same handwriting as all of the other affidavits. And yet, there was no mention of Harriet Tubman being illiterate in any of these documents that she allegedly wrote. In fact, her signature that was done in cursive writing is also identical of that same handwriting. And if you take an even closer look, you'll notice that each of her signatures are all marked by an X, while being accompanied by 2 other signatures of 2 separate witnesses. Now, even though in certain situations an X mark can be used to provide a signature for those people who are incapacitated due to illiteracy or disability, an X mark as a signature could also be used in the case of fraud and misinformation. According to a book by author Scott Richard Lyons called X Marks, Native Signatures of Assent, an X mark is a treaty signature. During the 18th and 19th centuries, it was a common practice for treaty commissioners to have their Indian interlocutors make X marks as signifiers of presence and agreement, meaning an Indian signature was recorded by the phrase, his X mark, and what the X mark meant was consent. An X mark also signified coercion. As everyone knows, treaties were made under conditions that were generally unfavorable to Indians, and as a result, they were often accompanied by protests. End quote. Harriet Tubman was finally awarded multiple other pensions, but only years after she died. And having been married twice with no biological children in between them and no records of next of kin, who are the beneficiaries of these new pensions, along with the money that is still being made from numerous books and movies about her story today.
Mrs. Christine Shack, their teacher, was asked about her pupils.
Mrs. Shack, do your pupils, who are, most of them, children of migrant families, are they anxious to get an education?
Terribly anxious, even more so than the child in the normal school here.
Do they get any help from their parents as far as schoolwork is concerned?
Usually you will find that the parents themselves are not educated. When we go out to enroll the children, oftentimes the parent will make an X and the person interviewing will have to sign it in order to get permission for the child to be enrolled in school. In order to get permission for the child to be enrolled in school. In order to get permission for the child to be enrolled in school.
I'm just here to make you think.